My name is Magnus, and today I'm going to be doing a video on chess fundamental concepts. Now, the reason for this is because you go online and you look for chess videos, complete beginner, you don't know what to do, and you just get bombarded with all of these opening tricks, opening videos where you learn how to checkmate in 4 moves, you learn the fried liver attack, and I think it's largely unhelpful to do that without first having a fundamental understanding of how the pieces interact and how they actually have their values and really the key concepts of the game of chess. And I think it's really important to know piece value so that you know when you're making a good trade, when you're in a better position, and these sort of the concepts of piece value and square control, I think can really help you try and evaluate your game much better. So I'm going to start with the pawns and how they've got their value. Now the pawns are sort of used as a baseline for all the other pieces. They're just given a base value of 1. However, this base value doesn't mean that all pawns are created equal. So you see there's pawns on the flank of the board, and the way that pawns work is that they control these 2 squares that go either side diagonally, like this. And that means that pawns from B to G all appear to be roughly the same in that they can each control the 2 squares like this on each of these files. We call these vertical lines are files, and these horizontal ones are ranks, in case you want to know what I'm talking about. But when we put the pawn on the A file, or the H file, you'll see that they're only controlling this square that goes into the position, in the middle of the board. Now, you'd think that means that these pawns are half as good as all the other pawns. Now, in reality, they're about 0.8 of all the other squares, but you can definitely think of these pawns as less valuable. And that hierarchy does continue in towards the middle of the board, where the B pawn is worth more than the A pawn, the C is worth more than the B pawn, and the central pawns, the D and E pawns, are worth more than all the other pawns together. But there's an additional complexity with pawns, which is that as they move further and further up the board, they gain in value. And this is because they have the ability to promote. So when you get your pawn to the 8th rank, you get to turn it into a queen, and the queen ends up being worth 9 points. We'll talk about why that is later. But that means that a pawn on the 7th rank is a lot more valuable because it's just about to turn into a queen than a pawn on the 2nd rank. Now, there are some people that claim that a pawn on the 7th rank is worth about the same as a rook, and the reason for that is often because the opposing side will have to sacrifice a rook when you make your promotion in order to stop you from getting a queen, and that's where the idea that the pawn on the 7th is worth about a rook comes from. But moving on to the bishop is a long-range piece. We can see how many squares it controls here, in all of these different diagonal ways. This is an optimally placed bishop in the center of the board, and always putting a piece in one of these central squares will maximize the number of squares that it controls, no matter which piece you're using. And that's simply because the long-range pieces benefit most from being in the center and accessing as far as they can. Knights, for example, could reach their maximum squares on another ring outside. Knights can also reach their optimal squares on this larger center, while bishops will only be getting their optimal amount. Bishops and queens only get their optimal squares when they're in the very center. And the reason for knights having this larger square, you'll see when I cover them. But the bishops get to cover 3 squares that way, 3 squares that way makes 6, 3 squares this way makes 9, and 4 squares this way makes 13. So the bishops get to cover 13 squares. Now that seems like a lot more than a pawn, and if you're taking what I said with the pawn as a baseline, you might think the pawn covers 2, it's worth 1, let's half the number of squares they control. Okay, bishop covers 13, let's call it 6 points roughly. Now, the reason why that's not the case is because, well, for one, the pawn has the ability to promote and become a queen, which makes it much more powerful. Also, pawn chains exist, and pawn chains are another benefit that the pawns have, making them much stronger together than they are as one or two, like you get with most of the minor pieces or the major pieces. Now, I haven't covered this yet, but minor pieces are bishop and knight, major pieces are rook and queen. That's it. And then there's the king. Okay. So pawns have a lot of benefit in that they can protect each other and they can turn into a queen. They can cover all different kinds of squares. So they can cover the dark squares and the light squares. As they move up the board, they alternate the squares that they control. They also have the benefit in that they can trade for any other more valuable piece, and it will always be a good trade. So often you'll find that your pawns can bully a knight backwards into the position. You can just keep pushing the knight back, and just like that, a knight's been overpowered, and you have made a queen. Knights are notoriously bad at stopping pawns. But back to the bishop. The reason why the bishop is worth less, even though it controls 13 squares, which is a lot, the bishop is actually only worth 3. And the reason for this is because it can only access one color complex. The bishop can never get onto the dark squares. And this can lead to bad situations where your bishop can get completely blocked in, for example, by your pawns, just like this. And the bishop will never be able to escape because the bishop can't just like sneak underneath and you know, and it would now be free. If the bishop is on this side, wow, it can go to basically every square other than these 4 over here. But often the bishop can get in tricky situations. It can't quite activate immediately in the game. So, for example, if we have a bishop starting on c1, the bishop can't get out yet. But if we were to put a knight, which is the next piece we're going to cover, the knight can escape because the knight can jump over the pieces. So that is a small benefit for the knight, and it's a cost for the bishop, which means that even though the bishop can control more squares, it actually has a roughly equivalent value to the knight. So putting the knight in its optimal square in the center, as we do with all the other pieces, it controls 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The knight gets to control 8 squares. So you think, okay, that seems a lot worse than the bishop. The knight can almost only controls a bit over half the squares of the bishop. This seems terrible. But the knight does have a lot of benefits. For one, the knight can jump and now controls the dark squares. So these are the dark squares the knight now controls. The knight jumps back, it's now controlling the light squares. So the knight can control both squares. And as previously mentioned, the knight can jump over the pawns. If we imagine some pawns here, the knight can jump over the pawns because it moves in this shape where it's 2 up, 1 across. So that's how the knights are moving. Also, another big benefit of the knight is that they're the only piece that can attack a queen without the queen attacking them. And that means they can be very useful in what we'll cover later, which are forks in a later video. And these are basic tactics. The knight can check the king and the queen, and it can win a full queen. So the knight is very tricky like that. And onto the rooks. The rooks are sort of like, you know, they're your primary piece. They don't really have many downsides. They also don't have big benefits. They do what they say on the tin. They cover 14 squares at all times. They cover 4 this way. Is it 14? Actually, wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, yeah, it's 14 squares at all times, no matter where you put them on the board. So I can put my rook in the center, I can put my rook in the corner. It will always cover 14 squares, 7 this way, 7 that way. And that's the great thing about the rook. The only downside of the rook is that the way it starts off is it's a bit hemmed in, and you'll either have to try and break it free, like that, or you can castle like this, and then you can often get it to an open file after you've traded off the center pawns. So the rook's quite simple. The rook is a strong piece. It's worth 5 points. It doesn't really have any downside. It controls 14 squares nicely. It can go to both colors. Nothing bad really to say about the rook. The queen is basically a rook and a bishop combined. So we have the 14 squares of the rook, like this, and we have the 13 squares of the bishop, like this. 14 plus 13 gives the queen 27 squares, and that is a very strong piece right there. And the reason why the queen ends up with a value of 9 rather than, say, 7, which might make more sense if you're doing 27 divided by 4, roughly about 7. The reason the queen has this extra value is because it's a singular piece that does all that square control, which means that it's extremely deadly when it comes to checkmating the black king. Now, I can show you this by the fact that the queen is able to actually force the king to move into the corner, and actually the queen is the only piece that can force the king to stalemate itself. So I'll show this. The way it works is you want to give what's called the knight's opposition, where you pretend that your queen is a knight checking the black king. And that means that the black king will keep having to move. I give it another check. Obviously this isn't actually check, but you pretend it is, and then you continue doing this, and not quite like that, but eventually you can chase the king into a corner by force and successfully stalemate the black king like a knight. And none of the other pieces can do that. The rook cannot force the king into the corner, because if the rook ever goes near the king, well, the king won't do that, but the king will take the rook, just like that. And also, I do remember that I forgot to cover why the knight gets the extended center, or what we call the larger center, like this. And the reason is because you can put the knight here, and it will still cover its 8 squares. As you can see, it's got these ones here, and then it's obviously got the mirror image on the other side. And it doesn't matter where exactly the knight is in this extended center, it will always do that. But once you move it over here, the knight can no longer reach these squares over that way, or that way. So the knight loses value. A knight on the corner is especially terrible. It's worse than a pawn. It only covers these squares. And actually, finally, onto the king. Now, the king generally doesn't have a value because the aim of the game is to checkmate the king, which means that you want the king to have no squares and be in check at the same time. Now, a check is when your enemy piece is attacking the king, and then it's the white player's turn. So, in this case, the black knight is checking the white king, which means that the white king has to move or take the knight. Now we can't take the knight, so we'd have to move, right? But a checkmate would be where, let's say, we've got our queen stalemate, and then we have our knight checking the king. This would be a checkmate, because the king is in check from the knight, and when it's white's turn, white can't move out of the check because the queen is stalemating the king. And stalemate being when the king can't move, but the king is in check and stalemated, that's a checkmate. Okay. But onto the value of the king. The king, I believe, actually has a value of around 3 to 4. But that's only in the endgame when it's actually safe for the king to go out. And the reason for this is because the king can move to any color complex in this sort of force field around the king, which is very useful in endgames, especially when you can, say, chase down a knight, for example. So the king can actually harass this knight indefinitely, and sometimes the king can even catch a knight in the corner. And when this happens, the king literally just walks in and takes the knight, and that's no good for the knight. So kings are very strong. They're good at fighting in these pawn endgames. So for example, in this endgame, if black moves here, this is the concept of shouldering the opponent king, where you can force the black king, because they have to move somewhere. The black king will have to give way to the white king. The white king pushes the black king back, it claims these squares, and you can end up with a situation like this, and then like this. Anyway, eventually you get a situation where the white pawn promotes and the black king is forced off the promotion square. But that's a bit more complicated. I think that should do it for covering all the pieces and where they get their values from. And from here, by learning piece value and also understanding that the more central a piece is, this is probably the most important takeaway, the more central your piece is, the more squares that it can control. So you want to maximize your pieces in the center of the board. You also want to put your pieces onto squares where they control more enemy territory. So as you can see, a knight here controls all of these squares of enemy territory, and 2 squares are on the center. And basically enemy territory is these 4 ranks on the other half, and your side is these 4 ranks on this half. And you want to control as much of this side as possible, because that's where the opponent's king will most likely be. And the more squares that you control on this side while their king is there, the more likely you are to checkmate them. And obviously the goal of the game is to checkmate, so you want to be as close as possible. Okay. And yeah, I think that fairly well explains opening principles. So you always hear that you want to control the center. The reason you want to control the center is because if you can control the center, then you can more easily get into your opponent's side of the board. And if you can get to your opponent's side of the board, you can get to the king, which therefore comes the next principle that you hear people saying, which is that you want to castle. Now, castling is like this. You go from here to here. The way it works, there's some confusion around this. You actually just want to move the king 2 squares in whichever direction you're castling, and then you swap the rook over. So if you're castling queenside, you just move 2 squares and swap the rook. So that's all there is to it. But castling will help get your king to a more safe square, and at the same time it gets your rook to a more central file. And central files have better value than the flank files, slightly. So yeah, and then finally there's develop your pieces, but develop your pieces is pretty much just linked to control the center. You just want to develop your pieces towards the center. And that's where all the beginner openings really start to come in. I'll be doing a video on beginner openings that I would recommend. Mostly it's the Scotch game with black and with white and black, e4 e5 stuff, which is just like that. The reason for this is I'll set up the starting position. Oops. I might have to just wait. Okay, I'll just edit this out. So I'll set up the starting position. Oh, there we go. I just had to click that button. So in the starting position, I like e4, e5 for newer players, because you can quickly get the bishop out, quickly get the knight out, and then castle the king, which should be pretty much your goal there. But I can explain that in the next video. Thank you for watching. I hope that this was informative, especially if you're completely new. I think, yeah, I've covered how the pieces move, and I hope that you'll be back for my opening lecture. Also, I plan to be sharing how a little bit about myself, how I got to 2400 in about 4 years. So I started during lockdown, like a lot of people, and initially I wasn't really too sure how to improve. I kind of just started playing lots of games, analyzing them, of course, watching some YouTube channels. But I really fell into a bit of a trap of opening gambits and tricks, relying too much on them. I mean, even got to a point where, like, if I didn't get my fried liver or whatever it is, I would be resigning the game because I just didn't know what to do. So you don't want to be in a situation like that. It's important to have strong fundamentals, and if you have strong fundamentals, then you should be able to improve fairly quickly and hopefully get over 1000. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.